Today we're going to learn about the new phase animator in SwiftUI. So far, we've used normal transitions, meaning that we have a beginning and an end. But what if you want to have more than two stages of animation? So for example, it would go to frame 600 of height, and then 200, and then 100, and finally 300. What if you can also control the animation timing for each of the stages? So that's what Phase Animator is going to allow us to do. Now let's start with the simplest way to use Phase Animator, and that is to use the modifier called Phase Animator. Now you will have the phases, and this can be expressed using an array, so square brackets, and you're going to set the values for your animations right from here. So for example, if you're using a scale value, I'm going to start with 1, and then the second phase is 1.1. And also, Phase Animator is going to reset back to 1 and then 1.1, and it's going to loop back and forth, unless of course you set a trigger. But let's start with just a loop. So for content, just press enter. And now I'm going to receive the value, which is first the content and then the phase. The content is going to be the image itself, and the phase is going to be the values that we have in the array. So what we're going to do is put content dot scale effect, which is the modifier that we're going to use to animate, and then apply phase. So now we have multiple values. So as you can see, the animation is looping between these values as if you're creating a loop, or it's just going back and forth between them. And of course, you can decide to have more values, such as, let's say 2 and then 0.5, and then it's just gonna go one after another. Now that's really simple and easy to use. All we needed to set up was the values and the modifier that's going to receive these values. And now we can customize a bunch of things, such as the trigger, as I mentioned before. So I'm just going to add comma, and then the trigger, which is going to be is tapped. So as a result, this animation will only happen when I tap on the play button. So you can see that right there. Let's keep things simple, and I'm gonna go back to just having two values. Now we're going to discuss about the animation timing. As you can see, both of them are pretty much using a default ease animation timing. And so we're going to change that by adding animation. And here we're going to also receive phase. Now using this phase, which hold these two values, I'm going to set conditions. So if we're at this value, it's going to have a certain animation timing, and if it has 1.1, it's going to have a different animation timing. And typically you can do if statement, and when you have more than, let's say, 2 if statements, you want to use something like switch. So switch phase and then curly braces. So basically I'm saying if the phase, and then based on that value, I'm going to set multiple cases. If this, else, if this, else, if this. And this is just a cleaner way to write that. So instead, I'm going to set case 1 colon, then set the animation to bouncy, and then case 1.1 colon, set the animation to snappy. Now, it's going to complain that it needs to be exhaustive, meaning that there should always be a default case. So basically, else, otherwise, or a fallback. So I'm just gonna use this error and click on fix. And so for the default, I'm gonna set to ease in out. Now I don't need this extra spacing, so I can just be consistent with the rest. So you have your switch, and then you have the multiple cases and the default case. So what's going to happen now is that when I press on it, you can see that it bounces at the beginning and then it does a snappy. Let's make it more obvious by using ease out, this time with a duration. So if you set it to 2 seconds, it's going to be much slower. So now you have your bounce and then it does a very slow ease out like this. Perhaps it's a little bit slow. I'm gonna set it to 1 second instead. Now, what if you want to set multiple effects at the same time? So we have these values are specific to the scale effect, and we use that directly because it's the simplest way to apply Phase Animator. But you can also use this to set the condition at which you're setting the animation timing, but also you can add, let's say, a new modifier called blur using radius. And at this point, you can say at which phase it's going to apply a specific blur. So for example, I can say phase is equal to 1.1 question mark. I'm going to set the blur to 20, otherwise 0. So by default, it's not going to have any blur, but when it reaches the phase that has a value of 1.1, then it's going to have a blur 20. So let's give that a test. You can see that it's blurring on the second phase, and it's doing that every time. Now, another thing that you can do if you want to have multiple effects is to have a second phase animator modifier. So we're going to do that before the first phase animator. And this time, instead of using actual values for the modifiers such as scale, I'm just going to use 1, 2. So this will express that I'm at phase 1 and then phase 2, and if you want to add more, phase 3 and 4, you can do so. And then I'm going to set the content, receive my phase values, and set my content dot, let's say the blur, which is what I want to animate. Again, using the same technique, I'm going to set phase is equal to 2, question mark, 100, otherwise 0. Now, if we do this, we don't need the second blur on the second phase animator. I can just remove it and use it here. It's going to blend together. And also, I should set the trigger as well. So trigger is tapped. So it should do exactly the same as before, except that now we have 100 blur, and it's mixing those animations. As you can see, there's a ton of flexibility when working with Phase Animator and using the values and setting the different conditions and modifiers. Now, before we go, I just want to set the different Phase Animator to different parts of the content. But before that, I want to make my code a little bit cleaner so that we can add additional modifiers. So when you start having a lot of elements in your UI and the code gets pretty long, it's good to have external or internal components and divide your code. So for example, I can set this VStack right here and I'm going to call it content. So I can do that inside the current component. So double click on this and just select everything for the VStack. And I'm going to name this one content. I'm going to declare that later. So first of all, I'm going to scroll down at the very bottom, and right after linear gradient, I'm going to set var content of type SumView, which is the same as the body, and then paste all of that VStack. Now let's do the same for the HTAG, which is this little menu right here. So I'm going to find the HTAG after the content and select all of that stuff. And if you're not sure, double click the curly braces. And then from here, I'm going to select the HTAG, cut it again, and I'm going to name this play. So now I'm going to create everything after the content. So right before the final curly braces, and I'm going to declare that. So var play of type SumView, and then curly braces and paste that whole H tag. So make sure to resume the preview again to make sure that everything is in order. Sometimes you can click on the refresh icon, or you can just press space within the code and delete it afterwards to refresh the preview. This is especially useful when you do copy and paste, because often when you do that, it's not going to refresh your preview properly. And also during animation, just doing a little space and delete it is going to refresh your entire screen, the preview, the code, and so on. Next, we're going to fix the indentation, because depending if it's a stack or a component, the indentation is going to be different. So you can just select the code and Control I to fix the indentation. So I'm going to move the phase animator, the second one, to the content instead. And now I'm going to test that. But notice again, using copy and paste is not going to refresh. So press a little space here, and that should fix the problem. Let me switch that to dark mode to see how it looks like. And it's great. I love this little outline, so I can just copy this overlay modifier and apply that to the image as well, right before offset. And here you're gonna have to press space, otherwise it's not going to appear. And keep in mind that whenever you press space and you move around, Xcode is going to automatically delete whatever extra space that you have. So that's quite useful. You don't have to do it manually. And finally, we have a problem where we have this line right here, which of course we can animate the rounded corner, or we can also use an opacity modifier using isTab ? To 0, otherwise 1 by default. So now when I do this, it's going to make the outline disappear in full screen mode. All right, in the next section, we're going to learn about the new keyframe animator in SwiftUI 5, which gives us even more control over the animation timing. So I'll see you in the next section.